Hey y'all, how are you doing? I'm great. Thank you so much for asking. It's me, Kim, and I'm back for another video. This video continues our series of conversations about prison abolition and why our current criminal legal system, including policing and prisons, are just not made to keep our communities safe and healthy and stable. This time I'm speaking with Professor Leigh Goodmark. She is a law professor at the University of Maryland. She is co-director of the clinical law program there. And she wrote a book called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence that blew my mind. When I first heard Professor Goodmark talk about this book on NPR about a year ago, she explained why throwing the proverbial book at abusers doesn't work, why if we really want to stop intimate partner violence, we have to completely rethink the way that we're approaching it. It was so compelling. I knew that I wanted to talk to her one day, and this is the day. Here's our conversation.
First of all, I have been recommending decriminalizing domestic violence to so many people because we're having these conversations about different institutions and changing policing, and it is such a great resource.
Thank you so much for saying that. It's interesting that when it came out 2 years ago, it was a little ahead of its time, and now it's even a little bit behind its time in some ways. But I really appreciate that it's helping people to think through some of the hard questions that get raised about, in a world of defund the police, what does our response to gender violence look like?
Yeah. When you say now it feels a little behind the times, what do you mean?
So when you get to the conclusion of the book, one of the things that I say is decriminalizing domestic violence is unlikely, which I still think is true, and possibly unwise. And I would no longer say that I think it's unwise. I think that my views on a lot of things have changed significantly in the last 2 years. And as I've been talking about the book since it came out, I've pretty consistently said, I wouldn't say that anymore because I do believe that the criminal legal system does so much more harm than any potential benefit it could give that I don't think it's unwise anymore. So I think when people read it with an abolition framework, they think, well, it doesn't go far enough. It's reform, and we don't want reform. We want defund, and we want abolition. And I think that's what I want now too. But I hadn't yet, at the time that I wrote the book, gotten to that place. I think my imagination still wasn't open to the idea of a world without police and a world without prisons. And so there are some reformist proposals at the end. And I think now I would just end it by saying, you can't fix this problem this way. Violence doesn't fix violence.
I am so glad you said that. Okay, because I was going to ask, because you do state in the book that you believe that there are some criminal legal interventions that we should keep, and I was going to ask, okay, so what should we keep? Do you still think that there are things about this system that we should stay intact?
I don't, actually. And I think it's a really great conversation for people who feel afraid in this moment to open up their minds and say, I care deeply about this issue of gender violence. I'm really worried about what happens primarily to women, but to everyone when they're in an abusive relationship. And no one is offering me anything other than policing and incarceration. And so I'm holding on really tightly to that because I'm afraid. And I think that's where most people's inability to imagine a world without police and a world without prisons comes from, is that fear of, what happens to me in my intimate relationship, particularly if you're a survivor. What happens to me if this person comes back? And that's not to say that there aren't seriously scary people out there and that we don't have to think through how to respond to those situations. I'm still a practicing lawyer. I still have clients who have partners who are scary. And we do need to think through, what's the response for those people going to look like? How do we help people feel safe and be safe? But I don't think the carceral system is going to get us there.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So let's talk about your background and how you got into this work.
I came out of law school like a lot of people who go to law school. I wanted to change the world. I thought the way that I was going to do that was in working with children. And it turned out that children had families. I started practicing law 25 years ago in Washington, D.C. at a time when very few people were systematically providing services to victims of domestic violence. And so, along with some friends who came out about the same time that I did, we really started to provide services to victims of violence in the district in a comprehensive way. And so, as I started to do that work, I really fell in love with it. I fell in love with my clients. But pretty much from the beginning, my clients were challenging the ways in which I understood domestic violence. I came out as a white, middle-class, cis, hetero kid with lots of advantages who thought, well, of course, these guys are monsters and you have to lock them up because that's what we do. And I'll never forget a client, I was helping a client get her divorce, and I was so excited for her because this was it. This was the last legal tie to this guy, and he had been really abusive to her. And I was really excited. And I said, aren't you excited? And she said, no. She said, this isn't what I thought my relationship would be, and this wasn't what I wanted for my family or for my children. She's like, I know that I need to do this, but I'm not excited about it. And then I educate myself, and I read, and I give Beth Ritchie 99% of the credit and Angela Davis the other 1%, and then lots of people following. But it was really Beth Ritchie and reading her work that made me understand for the first time. And I was working in DC, so I was working primarily with women of color and primarily with Black women, to understand that experience in a way that I had no capacity to understand it as a 24-year-old legal services lawyer. I love my clients and I love the work. I'm still excited about it. And so I've never regretted doing it for a minute. But almost from the beginning, the way that I looked at the legal system and what the legal system could realistically do for people and what it couldn't do was starting to change.
Beth Ritchie wrote Arrested Justice, is that correct?
Beth Ritchie wrote Arrested Justice, and before that wrote Compelled to Crime.
Yes, and it was so good.
It was Compelled to Crime that really started things for me.
Yeah. So you touched on something. Now the common feminist stance is we need to treat intimate partner violence like a crime and prosecute offenders and separate women who are abused from the perpetrators of their abuse, or we should say people who are abused from the perpetrators of their abuse, and incarcerate them. But that was not always the case. So when did that change?
So I'd say that's a feminist stance, but not the feminist stance. And so let me take you back and then we'll make that make sense.
Okay.
In the late 70s, so there's all this historical record about the ways in which the legal system has intervened in domestic violence going back kind of to colonial times. It's super interesting for anybody who is interested in it. But by the time we get to like the 70s, 80s, police are regularly not intervening. Prosecutors are regularly not prosecuting. And that's when part of the mainstream feminist movement and coming off of the anti-rape movement starts to say it's the legal system that's failing here. And if the legal system were doing its work, if it was doing its job properly, we wouldn't have this rate of intimate partner violence. And so the legal feminist community largely, and some in the grassroots community, starts to move towards these legal interventions. But it's important to know that right from the beginning, women of color particularly, some other women, but really women of color, were saying, this is a bad idea. This is not going to work for us. This is not going to work for our communities. This is a bad idea. And in fact, one of the biggest feminist advocacy organizations of the time, and still, the National Women's Law Center, originally did not sign on to the Violence Against Women Act because it was concerned about the carceralization of intimate partner violence. And that I credit Brenda Smith, who's now a law professor at American University, who was their senior counsel at the time, for saying, this is a bad idea for our communities. So in the 80s, a couple of things happened that really put us on this path towards the criminal legal response. And 1984 is kind of a watershed year. Three things happen in 1984 that are important. One, the Attorney General's Task Force on Family Violence comes out with a report that for the first time says intimate partner violence is a criminal justice problem. It needs a criminal justice solution. That's the last time you'll hear me say the words criminal and justice together. That's not a formulation that I use, but that's a quote, more or less. It's the first time the federal government really says this is a problem of crime that we're going to put resources behind. The second thing that happens is that Tracy Thurman wins a multi-million-dollar judgment in Torrington, Connecticut, after her husband, who has been abusing her for years without any kind of police response, abuses her so severely that he leaves her partially paralyzed. And the story is kind of horrible. There's actually a Lifetime movie about it. But her husband stabs her, the police come, they don't arrest him. He's walking around the scene unfettered. He then comes towards her again. He drops their child on top of her. He's still not arrested. And it's only when he approaches her a third time that they finally arrest him. Wow. Jurisdictions all over the country look at this and they say, well, we're going to get hit for multi-million-dollar verdicts if we don't do something about our police. So what's the something we're going to do? Well, the third thing that happens is the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment. And that was a study that showed that arrest deterred intimate partner violence, deterred future violence. And even though the authors of that study at the time said, we have to replicate this before we really know that these are good results, they also were hyping it up quite a bit. And people got this idea that arrest was the way to deter intimate partner violence. You bring those three things together and you start to see jurisdictions passing mandatory arrest laws. Those laws say anytime police have probable cause to make an arrest, they must make an arrest, depriving police of any discretion not to do so. And that's what sets us on the path that we're on now. And you see that really clearly in the Violence Against Women Act in 1994, which puts huge amounts of resources behind the criminal legal system for the first time.
So can I just on VAWA, something I thought was interesting, and I don't know, my knowledge of this period is not super great, wasn't super around at that time, but I do think it's interesting that both VAWA and the crime bill, Joe Biden had he was a seminal force in the creation and the passage of both of those bills, and he's still endorsing policies that are along those same lines, but that we know don't work.
That is absolutely true. And in fact, VAWA is part of the crime bill.
Yeah.
VAWA is part of the 1994 crime bill. It comes about because Biden, who is one of the principal authors of that bill, says to his staffer, Victoria Norse, what are we going to do for women in the crime bill? Yeah. And what they come up with is the Violence Against Women Act. And so I want to be super clear about VAWA. VAWA does some really good and important stuff, but mostly what VAWA does is fund the criminal legal system. If you look at the trends in VAWA funding over time, in 1994, about 65% of VAWA funding went to the criminal legal system, and by the 2013, the last authorization in 2013, about 85% was going to the criminal legal system. So that's primarily what VAWA does. And again, important things that VAWA does I would keep, but mostly what VAWA does is give money to courts, to police, to prosecutors, and to community-based agencies to partner with courts and cops and prosecutors. And Biden continues to say that VAWA has been an unalloyed success. He says regularly, intimate partner violence in the United States has dropped by 63% since the passage of VAWA. And that's true, but it's misleading because all crime in the United States has been decreasing since the passage of VAWA. And if you look at the drop in the crime rates from 1994 to the year 2000, domestic violence drops about the same amount as the crime rate, maybe a little bit more, 48% to 47%. But if you look at the period from 2000 through about 2016 or 2018 where we have data, domestic violence drops less than the drop in the overall crime rate, at the same time that we're putting hundreds of millions of dollars into policing just this one crime, right? Or I should say it's more than one crime, but this one area of violence against women. And so you have to ask, what is that money buying us? If we're putting hundreds of millions of dollars into the system and we're not even getting the same drop that we are seeing overall for the crime rate, that is not money that's being well spent, and that's not persuasive to me that we're getting any real impact out of these policies. So even, taking away kind of how destructive these policies are, which is a whole other part of this conversation, just in the is it working by sheer rates of violence, the answer I think has to be no.
Yeah. So I know a lot of people who would say, okay, it's like over $5 billion has been allocated because of the Violence Against Women Act. Is that correct?
It's something like that. I've never done the math on the total, I have to admit.
Okay. So I feel like I know people who would say, well, they're just using the money wrong. Like, what if we just force police departments to get domestic violence training or de-escalation training or bystander intervention training? Why wouldn't that work?
One, some of that money does some of those things, and we haven't seen any real changes in policing. So I think that's one thing to think about. We've been training police, every time you see a policy recommendation about domestic violence, what it says is we just need better police training. Well, we've been training police for 40 years, and I don't see really the kind of the outcomes that we'd want to see from that. And I think it's because policing is an inherently violent institution. And policing as it is currently constituted in the United States draws people who use violence. And we haven't talked about yet the ways in which police are perpetrating gender-based violence at the same time that we're asking them to intervene to protect people from gender-based violence. And that is in all kinds of ways, right? That's Daniel Holtzclaw, who is raping 18 women that we know of as a police officer. And that's police officers who are raping sex workers or forcing people to perform sexual services in exchange for not arresting them. And that's cops who show up and ask women for their phone numbers when they're taking victim statements for them and pressure them into dating them in order to get charges brought. And that's cops who perpetrate violence against their own partners. Rates of intimate partner violence are higher among police officers than they are in the general population. And so if the same people are perpetrating violence and we're asking them to intervene, that seems deeply problematic to me. And so we can do all the training in the world that we want, but when we tell people, here's your gun, here's your badge, and what that entitles you to do is to use violence to keep the peace, we are all but ensuring that that violence is going to get used not only against the people that some people would like to see it used against, but against partners, against victims, against lots of people who you'd have much more concern about.
Yeah. So ever since I've come out and said that I don't think police can be reformed, people have asked me questions about women who have no one else to turn to. The police are their only resource. So many people have sent me stories about women who've been killed by their partners, and they say, what about this? And I've looked at those stories, and I often find that those women have taken the steps in our criminal legal system that we tell people to take. They take out protective orders. They've filed police reports. Why are these systems and processes not saving women's lives?
Because they're not changing the people who they need to change. So to back up, right, there's no good evidence to suggest that the criminal legal system deters people from committing further acts of violence. I talked about the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment and the idea that arrest would deter violence. Well, in the replications of the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment, they didn't have those same findings. And what they found was that arrest had a slight deterrent effect in some communities, had no effect in other communities, and actually spurred violence in other communities. So there's no data that suggests that arrest by itself is deterring violence. There's no data that suggests that prosecution by itself is deterring violence, or that incarceration by itself is deterring violence. The only data that suggests that the criminal legal system has that kind of impact says that basically when you have closely monitored conditions of parole or probation, then you have some decrease in violence. So basically you have to sit on somebody to make sure that they're not violent. The tools that we're using, both in the civil system and in the criminal legal system, are inadequate to do the job that we're asking them to do because they're premised on separation. And most people don't separate. Most people want to either continue their relationships or want to continue their relationships, which means they're going to continue to be in contact with each other. And we don't focus on changing the behavior of the person who is problematic, and we don't focus on the structural conditions that drive intimate partner violence. And we've treated intimate partner violence as a personal failing. It's just this guy, right? It's not always a guy, but this guy, and he's a bad guy. And it's just who he is, and he's just going to be violent, and the only thing we can do is lock him up. And what we haven't looked at is the research that says, well, male under and unemployment is a significant driver of intimate partner violence. So maybe if we helped people get jobs and invested in employment, we would decrease intimate partner violence. In 2016, the Obama administration did a study that showed that you could decrease all violence in the United States by raising the minimum wage. Right? There are serious economic forces at issue here, and we don't talk about them at all. We also don't talk about trauma and the fact that many people who are using violence have also experienced trauma themselves. And the reason that we don't talk about trauma in our movement, in the anti-violence movement, is because for some people it feels like you're giving somebody an excuse. Well, it's not an excuse, it's an explanation. And explanations help us change behavior. So if we can say both, yes, this person is traumatized and this person is harming others, and we know that trauma is closely correlated with the perpetration of intimate partner violence, why wouldn't we try to do something to address that trauma? If you look at the ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences studies, you see that the more ACEs somebody has experienced, the more likely they are to perpetrate intimate partner violence. So why aren't we intervening to try to protect kids from parental violence and community violence and the other kinds of trauma that down the road can lead to perpetration? By using the legal system, which is an after-the-fact remedy, right? It doesn't do anything until something bad has happened. And it only does something for a very small subset of cases, only for those things that we call criminal, which is generally violence and threats of violence. That is such a limited, blinkered way to try to do the much bigger job of preventing intimate partner violence and changing the conditions, both personal and structural, that lead to intimate partner violence. And so that's why the system fails, is because it's not set up to do the work that it needs to do. It's only set up to provide punishment. And punishment isn't changing violence, and punishment isn't deterring violence. It just isn't. And using shame-based punishment particularly is unlikely to have an impact on violence, because shame is one of the drivers of violence. So all of these tools that we're using to intervene are actually more likely to create more violence than they are to prevent it in any kind of way. That's why we're failing.
Oh, Professor Goodmark, you are a professional, for real. That was such a wonderful, just a meaty answer. Okay. All right. So people have a great deal of sympathy for women, people who are being abused and want to leave their partners, and they've been harmed. But it seems like people have a lot less sympathy for people in abusive relationships who want to stay. And so how do we change attitudes around what it means to be in a cycle of abuse?
So that's a really great question. And again, going back to Beth Ritchie, one of the things that really changed the way that I thought about this was Beth Ritchie's research looking at women who'd been in relationships, women of color particularly, who'd been in abusive relationships. And one of the things that her early research showed was that on average, Black women had been in relationships for 2 years before the violence started. So if you think about where you are 2 years into a relationship, you are invested. You are emotionally invested. You may be economically invested. You may have kids together. We don't think about the extent to which people have these emotional, economic, and other kinds of ties to their partners. And people really don't like to talk about the fact that people love their partners who are abusive, that they don't like the abuse. I have yet to meet anybody who likes the abuse, but they love their partners. They just want their behavior to change. And the legal system can't do that at all. It doesn't do that at all, right? It only intervenes after the fact. It only intervenes to separate people. So we have to be open to hearing from people who say, I don't want out of my relationship. I want my relationship to change. And then think about, okay, so what are the places where we can make a difference in the behavior that enables that change to happen? And that goes back to all of these remedies that I was talking about in terms of prevention, in terms of economic remedies, in terms of, we have better intervention counseling. It's based on a kind of a one-size-fits-all narrative that says, domestic violence is about power and control against one's intimate partner in the service of the patriarchy. That may be true for some people, and while I absolutely believe that power and control are the outcomes of intimate partner violence, I'm not sure that I believe that that's why people are being violent in the first place. They're being violent because they feel out of control altogether. They're being violent because there are stressors in their lives. There are all kinds of reasons why people are violent. And if we don't start to really interrogate those reasons, we won't make any kind of difference for these people who want to stay in relationship. And even for people who don't want to stay in relationship, it's really important that we change the behavior, because people will go on to have other relationships, because people are tied by children, and so they'll go on to have some kind of communication and interaction with their former partners, even if they're no longer with them. We have for so long ignored the fact that the criminal legal system doesn't change the fundamental problem, which is the behavior, which is the use of violence. And until we start to focus on that change, we're not going to get anywhere.
Is there ever a case for saying to somebody who is in an abusive relationship, we know you're in love, we know you want to stay, but this is clearly a dangerous person and you need some separation, so the state is going to intervene on your behalf?
Right. I personally never think the state has the right to do that. It's a zero-sum game. Only one person gets to make that decision, right? Either the state makes it or the person who's being harmed makes it. And all of our risk assessment tools are beaten by people in really violent relationships who can tell you when they're going to be hurt. There's no risk assessment tool that outperforms what a person knows. And I'm going to sometimes default to women because most of the research is on women. So what the research says is that abused women know better what their level of risk is than almost any tool that we can show them or any instrument. Giving the state that kind of power simply puts the state in the shoes of the person who's using violence, because it means that the state now gets to tell you what to do instead of the person who's using violence getting to tell you what to do. And are there going to be people who get hurt? Oh, absolutely. Right? Are people going to die as a result of that? Definitely. They die now, and it's exactly what you alluded to earlier. There are people who do everything right? Air quotes again, right, that they get protective orders and they use the criminal legal system and they are killed anyway. We can't ever guarantee that people won't get killed. So from my perspective, the most important thing is to give people as many options as humanly possible, to help people understand what those options are, and then to say, what do you want to do? And how can I help you in achieving whatever it is that you want to do? I teach my law students a kind of lawyering called client-centered lawyering that is very much about the lawyer and the client as partners in a process, but with the client having the power to make those determinations. And I think particularly in working with people who've been harmed or people who've been subjected to abuse, it is so important that we not take agency from people who have already, in many cases, had agency taken from them in really important ways. That's not to say that I don't worry about some of my clients. I have one client in particular who has gone back and forth with a really abusive partner over a number of years. And I have said to her, I support you. I'll do whatever you want to do here. I'm worried about you. Can we think about how ways to keep you safe? Can we think about what we do if something bad happens? And I think the best thing that we can do is to let people know that whatever choice they make, we are still here. That I'm not judging that choice, that I support you in whatever you do. And if that choice doesn't pan out the way you want it to, I'll still be here to help. And that's what I've always tried to do with my clients.
When we're talking about forced state intervention, I as somebody who has done lots of reading about how the state in many different ways has intervened in the lives of Black women and Black children and made their lives like materially worse, that really concerns me if we give people the discretion to be paternalistic in that way. I don't
Absolutely.
think that it ends well, especially for marginalized communities.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I can't imagine why anyone in the Black community, in the Native community, in Latinx communities would look at the government and say, oh, this is a help, right? When you look at the history of child welfare involvement in Black families, when you look at the way that women are still prosecuted for the harms that are done by others in the child welfare system, when you look at the decimation of Native communities and Native children, when you look at the way immigrants and undocumented people are being treated in this country, in what world does the state look like a good solution to you? To me, like, I'm always amazed that people do have any faith in these systems because they've failed them over and over again in ways that are deeply, deeply harmful.
So like you just mentioned, the system often punishes people who experience abuse. Talking about the horrible mandatory arrest policies and no drop prosecution policies. I'm from Oklahoma, and there's a really famous case of a woman. Her name was Tondaleo
Hall.
Tondaleo.
Yep.
Yes,
Hall.
yes.
Yep.
So could you talk a little bit about how that happens, how the system that we have often punishes the people who need help the most?
That is, I think, one of the most abusive cases of state intervention that I have ever seen. And I represent incarcerated women, so that's going pretty far. So in that case, there was a law that said if you fail to protect your child from being abused or neglected, you can be held criminally responsible for that abuse or neglect. And in that case, Ms. Hall's boyfriend had broken the baby's ribs and also a femur, I think a couple of other bones. The abuse was pretty severe. She wasn't in the room when it happened. She wasn't around when it happened. She was trying to leave him when it happened. She had asked others for help. She was doing everything that we suggest that people should do. And her baby was deeply, deeply harmed. So they arrest both Mr. Braxton, I believe his name is, and Ms. Hall. Mr. Braxton, who is the person who has done the harm, and Ms. Hall for failure to protect, what's called failure to protect. And they both take plea deals. And her plea deal requires her to testify against him. So they transport them in the same car, in the same van. She's going back and forth to the trial, and he's terrifying her. He's abusing her in the transport, going to and from, and she's terrified of him, of what he might do. And she doesn't testify the way that the district attorney wants her to testify. And that makes the district attorney upset, because the district attorney then can't make the case that he wants to make. Now, backdrop is Oklahoma has the highest rates of incarceration of women in the nation. So a punitive intervention against women, not the least bit surprising. Her plea deal basically falls through as a result of the district attorney's unhappiness with her. And when it comes to time for her sentence, the district attorney says she should have life in prison. Now, has she harmed her child? No. Did she try to get help? Yes. Did she do what she could in the context of a very violent, very scary relationship where nobody was really forthcoming? Yes. And she ends up incarcerated originally for 30 years. Now, I don't think there's any way to justify that. But maybe if someone does, you say, well, it's because he gets longer than 30 years. But he doesn't. Right. He gets time served, which was 2 years. So the person who did this damage to both Ms. Hall and her children serves 2 years. and she's originally sentenced to incarceration for 30 years. She's recently been released on parole, which is, she still was there for far longer. I mean, she was, to be there at all was far longer than she needed to be there, but it's appalling. And the ways in which we treat women who don't conform to our notions of what a victim should do and what a victim should look like are very much underneath what happens to Ms. Hall in that case.
Yeah. I heard you say this in another interview about how our current system reinforces the idea that men are always the aggressors and they're malicious and demonic, and women are angelic and helpless. And if you are not, if people don't perceive you as being angelic and helpless and a damsel in distress, which is, those are not things that are often extended to Black women,
right,
then we think that punitive measures, our system says that you deserve punitive measures or retributive measures instead of actual help that would help you live a better, more stable, safer life.
Yeah, and again, I want to pay tribute to the work of women of color who've been saying this forever, but we very much operate on binaries. And those binaries are that the perpetrator of violence is evil and bad, and the victim of violence is blameless and perfect and good. And if you are not that thing, then you don't get help. For Black women particularly, stereotypes about Black women, not with nothing to do about how any individual Black woman presents, but just these stereotypes that operate around angry Black women, around powerful Black women. Those stereotypes influence the way that people in power see Black women when they walk into a courtroom. So you could be anything but angry. You could be deeply distressed, but you could get read as angry. You could be catatonic and you could get read as angry. Those things are operating sometimes on a conscious level, sometimes on a subconscious level, right? But they are operating. And so it makes it very, very difficult, particularly for Black women when they walk into a courtroom. And I've had this conversation with so many clients, which is to say, it's not fair and it's not right. But if we walk in there and you're perceived as angry, we lose. So we have to think about how we want to present. And I'm not saying it's right. And I'm saying if you present however you want. But if the legal relief is what you want, you may want to present one way. If telling your truth is what you want, I am here for it. You tell it however you want to tell it. Just know you might not walk out of court with what you want. Yeah. That I have to have that conversation with people shows you how deeply damaged the legal system is, particularly in the context of intimate partner violence. And if you read trial transcripts, because I'm geeky that way, and that's one of the things that I do, you'll see prosecutors go at, she's angry, she's strong, she's sassy, she's sarcastic, she stood up for herself, she had a weapon, she was drinking. All of these tropes get used to say, not a victim. Because if you're doing any of those things, you're not a victim and you don't get help. And it is amazing to me how quickly prosecutors can turn on a dime with victims of violence who, the minute they get charged with a crime, can no longer be seen as victimized in any way. And all of the violence that may have existed in their past gets written off as mutual affray, as she asked for it, as she was actually the more violent one. It is unbelievable that prosecutors who claim to be the defenders of abused women, as soon as they are charged with crimes, no longer see them in that way.
Yeah. I also wonder about how our criminal legal system impacts undocumented immigrants, undocumented women who are experience violence. Is there just a huge group of people who just don't report their abuse because they're afraid of the consequences?
So yeah, and it's not just undocumented people. Intimate partner violence is still relatively underreported to law enforcement. Only about half of incidents of intimate partner violence get reported to law enforcement, which again raises this question about why are we making this our primary response if half the people in the country don't want to use it? But within that group of people who aren't going to law enforcement, undocumented people are certainly a huge part of that. And there's a good reason for it, right? If you go to police and you don't happen to be an English speaker, who's telling the version of the story to the police that gets understood, right? The person who's been using violence. If you go to police and they find out that you're undocumented and you are in a community where the police are working with ICE, you could very well find yourself reported. And there have been a number of cases of women who went to the police to seek assistance and found themselves reported to ICE. So people know this within communities. They know if it's safe to go to the police or if it's not safe to go to the police. And even if there's no kind of word on the street that says it's really unsafe, in this climate particularly since 2016, knowing, but even before, because, we have to, I think, hold people responsible for the things that they do. And huge numbers of people were deported under the Obama administration.
Yes.
But in this climate particularly, I think people are more aware of how dangerous it is to go. But people who work with undocumented populations have been saying this for 40 years, that undocumented women, and again, the research is mostly on women, don't go to the police because they fear not only their own deportation, but also the deportation of their partners. That has real implications for parenting, for emotional support, for economic support, for a whole range, for community support. So knowing that your partner could get deported could also be a significant disincentive to going to carceral systems.
Yeah. All right, let's go back a little bit. You talked about how economic effects are so influential in whether or not somebody is going to experience or perpetrate domestic violence. What do you mean by that? How can fixing people's economic opportunity make them safer?
Sure. Intimate partner violence is much more prevalent among low-income people, and the lower your income is, the more likely you are to be subjected to intimate partner violence. And male unemployment, as I said earlier, is a significant driver, or a significant correlate, I should say, not a cause, but a correlation, a correlate of intimate partner violence. What that suggests is that there is something about economic strain that is highly correlated with intimate partner violence. And there are a couple of ways to think about this. One is, if we can put financial resources into the hands of people who are being abused, we give them options. Then they don't stay in relationships that are violent because they don't have economic options. Then they have more equality within those relationships because they have economic power. And so that's kind of one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is, if we can relieve those measures of economic strain, then if it's actually the economic strain that is driving the turn to violence, we're alleviating that condition as well. So both in thinking about providing economic power to people who've been harmed and providing economic power to people who do harm, there are, I think, promising ways to alleviate the kind of economic stress that goes with intimate partner violence. And these effects, it's not just about low-income individuals, it's about communities as well. The more distressed a community is, the more likely they are to have higher rates of intimate partner violence. And that comes from a lot of different things. It comes from the lack of community supports. It comes from the isolation that people may feel within distressed communities. It comes from incarceration, where people don't have strong ties to neighbors and family members because people are in and out so much. And so there aren't then places to turn to. I think one of the most promising things that's happened actually in the pandemic has been the real focus on mutual aid and the ways in which community can intervene to protect people from intimate partner violence. That, I think, is something that hopefully we'll take forward once this is all over and really build on.
Yeah. But I've also seen, and I'm not sure where exactly how they're measuring this, but I've seen people say that the pandemic and people being forced to stay indoors and in close quarters means that people who are experiencing intimate partner violence or domestic violence in their homes, that their lives are going to be much worse, like that the incidences are going to increase.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. I mean, one, close physical proximity. Two, increased trauma for lots of people. Three, increased economic stress for lots of people. I think the numbers are still a little bit up in the air, but I would not be surprised at all if rates of violence were increasing. It's how we respond to it that I think is the opportunity here. I've talked a lot about the importance of not responding carcerally right now, because essentially what that means is that you're putting somebody in a position where they could be severely harmed or killed. And so we have this opportunity right now to think about not sending, not arresting every time that there's an incident of intimate partner violence, knowing that, people cycling in and out of COVID-ridden jails and prison facilities are not only at risk themselves of getting infected, but of infecting people when they go back into community.
Yeah. Okay, so we made the case for why we've got to take the criminal legal system out, but then the big question is, then what replaces it? So could you talk a little bit about restorative justice and community-based solutions?
I'm happy to do that. I want to start by saying, though, that I don't pretend like I have all of those answers. That would be a pretty what's the arrogant thing to do, to say, and now here's how we replace all of this. And I think a lot of it is going to be trial and error. And I also want to say restorative justice is an amazing thing, and it is not the thing that's going to replace the criminal legal system. You're not just going to move carceral justice out and put restorative justice in. It can't work that way.
Right.
But for some subset of people, restorative justice is a really, really promising intervention. And so I think, taking a step backwards, one thing that we never talk to people about is, what does justice mean for you?
Right.
In this setting, as somebody who's experienced harm, what would it feel like to have justice? If your answer to that is punishment, we have that, right? That's the retributive justice of the carceral system. We've got that. But I don't think that's most people's answer. I think for most people, justice is, I want to be heard. I want somebody to tell me that what happened to me was wrong. I want community to come in around me. I need economic support. I need parenting support. I need all of these other kinds of things. And if those are your answers, then restorative justice is a process that might be really helpful for you. One of the kind of impediments to the widespread implementation of restorative justice is that, in my way of thinking about it, I wouldn't do restorative justice without somebody who's used harm who's willing to accept responsibility, to be accountable for that harm. And so in a lot of cases, that's not happening. People are not accountable for the harm that they do. They want to minimize, they want to deny. Partly that's, again, about the orientation of our current system. The presumption of innocence says to people, don't admit that you did anything wrong. Because in our system, you get to be found innocent until you're proven guilty. So we've created this incentive for people not to take responsibility at an early place. And it's kind of entrenched in us now that we don't take responsibility for things. When you deal with little kids, like, they get it. I'm not taking responsibility for anything. But if you have a system where you're saying, look, we're not going to punish you. We're going to figure out ways for you to make right what you did, right? To right this wrong that you did. And people are willing to accept that accountability, restorative justice can be really powerful, because it enables people to ask for what they need to find justice. So restorative justice asks 3 questions. What was the harm? What was the impact of the harm? And what do you need to have that harm made right? That may be pay my medical bills. That may be a better parent to our kids. That may be tell our community that this was your fault, not mine. That may be an apology, though it may not be. And so often people say, well, it's just forced apologies, and that's not really restorative justice at all. An apology, if you want it, sure. But an apology that gets offered out of nowhere, no, that's not restorative justice. It's about the person who's been harmed defining for them what they need to have it made right. And I think, one of the really powerful things about restorative justice is that it does engage community, because it can bring in the community of supporters for the person who's been harmed, the community of supporters for the person who's done harm. One of the critiques of moving away from the legal system's responses to intimate partner violence has been, well, you're going to re-privatize violence. You're going to send it all back into the home. Well, I don't know how many people actually go and hang out in courtrooms to watch the way that the system operates, but really our system of justice is not all that public now. So it's public in the sense that the state intervenes, but it's not public in the sense that the community has any sense of what's going on or what they could do to be helpful. I think restorative justice is actually much more public in that it brings the community in, and it has the opportunity to bring a much broader community in to say, look, we need your help in holding this person accountable. We need your help in getting this person what they need. Beyond just restorative justice, right, there's a whole broader conversation to be had about community accountability that people like Mimi Kim, through the organization Creative Interventions, have been doing that work for years. And I think Mimi Kim's work is absolutely incredible. For those who are interested, there is a 600-page toolkit that Creative Interventions made on the web, and you can go look at, how to respond to people when they need help. I think a big part of our problem is we don't know how to do it. Community doesn't know how to help. And we have to get people to a place where if somebody says, look, I've been harmed, community goes, okay, so how can we be helpful? And we have some tools to use for that.
So what should happen when a person who has experienced abuse not only doesn't want to engage with their abuser via restorative justice or transformative justice, but has a deep desire for retribution?
I have to admit to you, that's the place where I get hung up. And I have these two conflicting roles. One is somebody who just thinks about stuff, and one is somebody who actually represents people. And I would have a really hard time saying to one of my clients, you don't get to want that. Yeah. But I think the reason that people want it is because it's the only way that people understand justice. And I think that's true because it's the only justice we offer people. My hope is that when we can expand this idea of what justice is and can give people a broader sense of what might be available to them as justice, then people won't cling so tightly to the need for retribution. And I think, the work that Danielle Sered has done, and her book, Until We Reckon, I think is amazing, really talks about when you stop talking in terms of kind of justice and punishment, but you start talking about what do you really need and what do you really want, a lot fewer people than we think are really tied to this notion of punishment. And the other, I think, really powerful thing to look at is the narratives of people who've gotten that punishment and found that it didn't give them at all what they wanted. Because it doesn't give you closure. It doesn't bring back, it doesn't restore you to your former condition. It doesn't do the work that I think a lot of people think it will do.
Yeah. Can I say that I deeply appreciate how you and so many of the other people that I have had these kinds of discussions with say, I don't know, I'm not, I'm not 100% sure, because I think that it underscores that these are, we're not going to, and I said this in my conversation with Alex Vitale, we're not going to flip a switch one day and prisons are closed and there's no police. These are going to be processes, and it is going to be trial and error, and we're going to go this way, and maybe that didn't, I think it's useful to underscore that we're going to work towards something different and something better. And no, we don't know everything, but we can at least try. We can take some steps.
I think that's right. And I think, again, it's the fear of something going wrong that keeps us from trying. I've been talking about restorative justice for a really long time now, and I have yet to make it happen in Baltimore, which is where I am. And it's because it's really hard to get people to think differently without that fear of what happens if it goes wrong.
Yeah.
And, what that presupposes is that things are going right now. But if you look at the system that we have, it's not like it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's not working. And so what we'd be leaving behind isn't something that's, helping people restore them to their former positions and giving them justice and making them fulfilled and stopping violence. It's not doing those things. So it's not like leaving that system behind is going to materially change for the worse a lot of people's positions. It's just scary. Because if we don't keep doing what we've been doing, what would we do? I just think it's important too that there's no one person who's thought about this stuff who has the answer.
Right.
It's about working together to
Yes.
figure out what all of the answers could be and what all of the options are, and how, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and figure out all of the different kinds of things that we could be doing. And that requires collaboration. I just think that our fear of failure is so acute that it is stifling our creativity, and that is harming the people that we think that we're helping.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people too don't see all of the downsides or the negative things that happen as a result of carcerality. Like I said, I represent incarcerated women, the vast majority of whom have been subjected to violence in some way. People don't ever see them.
Yeah. All right, so along those lines, something that I will say does concern me just a little bit is there aren't a lot of big data sets about what happens when we implement restorative or transformative justice models large scale. So I appreciate the people who are doing it in their communities, where they can. But when I'm trying to explain to people, yes, this can work, there's not a whole lot. Like, people are like, I live in a city of 5 million people. What's going to happen? Should that be cause for concern?
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
People don't want to do it because there's no data, and there's no data because nobody can do it, because people don't want to do it because there's no data.
Yeah.
We have to jump in. We have to jump in and start piloting things. We also, it's funny as somebody who does scholarship, how US centric we are. There is data from other places in the world. Australia and New Zealand have been using restorative justice really productively for a long time. And there is data out of those programs. It's not comprehensive data. It's not the kind of thing. But there is some data that suggests that we could do good work here if we were willing to take that leap. And people want evidence-based policy, but if you don't have an evidence base, how are you ever going to make the policy? We just have to jump in and try it and acknowledge that we could be wrong. And if we're wrong, that we don't have to keep following failed policy. I mean, there's no data that suggests that mandatory arrest is doing anything for us, and a lot of data that suggests it's harmful, and yet it's still the law. It's still the policy that we follow. So we are not doing evidence-based policy work now in the world of gender violence.
Yeah. So my final question is, I know that this system cannot be transformed. I deeply believe that, and it's going to be a long road ahead. But are there things that individuals who know that this system is broken can do to provide better outcomes for people experience intimate partner violence?
I think looking at the mutual aid work that's going on now is the real roadmap for that. Because what that mutual aid work does is to say, understand what intimate partner violence looks like. Understand that victims are being stereotyped and people who use harm are being stereotyped, and that it's complicated and it's messy, and it's more than just physical violence, and it's more than just threats of physical violence, and it's more than the things that are criminalized. Once you understand the problem, remember that the worst thing that you can do for somebody who is experiencing violence is to be judgmental about their experience. It's just the same as any other issue in a friendship, right? You know, with a friend, that if you say, I don't know what you think you're doing right now, but you're screwing up, that friend is not likely to come back to you for advice. But if you say to your friend, look, I don't pretend to understand everything that's happening, but I'm here to help. Let me know what I can do to be supportive. Here are the things that I can offer you. Not just kind of the let me know, but the here's what I can do for you. I can give you a couch when you need one. I can give you $50 if you need it. I can help you think through these problems. I can pick up your kids from school, right? Here are the concrete kinds of things that I can do for you. I think pod mapping is really helping people think through what are the concrete things that I can ask from my community, and what are the concrete things I can do for other people. And having those kinds of interactions with the people that you care about, with your friends, that's the kind of individual level work I think that people can do. But I also think that it is important for people to be engaged in processes where decisions get made, so that when policymakers are saying, well, we have to continue to give hundreds of millions of dollars to the police because who else is going to respond to intimate partner violence? We can say violence interrupters can respond to intimate partner violence. And programs like Safe Streets in Baltimore have been doing that work for years. And we can do it through community in these ways, to be informed about what the other things are, so that when we're having these conversations on a policy level, we're not just focusing on individuals, we're focusing on structures. Until we deal with structural racism, until we deal with structural income inequality, until we take on some of these bigger correlates, we will continue to have this problem.
Okay, this is the last question, and I think you've touched on this, but I want to go back because I hear this a lot. Okay, so I think that people are concerned that if we move away from criminalization, that we are going to spend all of our time and energy and resources into people who commit harm, people who are harmful, and that time and energy and communal resource should instead be directed, all of it should all be directed to the people who are experiencing harm. Why is it so critical for us to address both things simultaneously?
Because the harm will continue to exist if we don't deal with the things that are causing the harm. So if we pour everything into folks who've been harmed, we haven't dealt with the problem. And the problem is the person who is using violence, the behavior of the person who is using violence. And that may be happening because of, we've talked about it, right? It may be trauma. It may be alcohol use, which we haven't really talked about. It may be income issues. There are lots of reasons why it's happening. But until we address why it's happening, it doesn't change. And so even if that one victim gets helped, all the victims down the line don't get helped. And we don't really change the system at all. I mean, we have this kind of image of like this person has one partner forever. That's unlikely. And so, if it's not going to continue happening to this person, it's going to happen to somebody else. Also, I just think that we want to live in a society where people are getting what they need. And that to say to kind of a whole group of people, you've rendered yourself ineligible for help because you've shown that you really need help, is just deeply problematic.
Right. Yeah. And that's what we have.
That's what we have.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Professor Goodmark. Like I said, decriminalizing domestic violence completely changed the way that I think about intimate partner violence, the way that I think about our criminal legal system. So I appreciate your work enormously. And yeah, shout out to Beth Ritchie, because Arrested Justice also changed my life as well. But yeah, thank you.
Thank y'all so much for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Hit me up on Instagram or Twitter. You guys, patrons, members, y'all been getting a lot from me. I've been spilling my guts about all the drama that's been happening. I've been really going in over there on the podcast. We have podcasts, we have syllabi, we have special patrons only events. We just set up the patron/members only Discord, which is like Slack, but fun. And we gonna talk about everything over there. So sign up for that. I'm super, super excited to dig in, because that's gonna be my home, to be honest, okay? Because social media is a little tricky for me right now, but whatever. We have new merch. Buy some merch. I appreciate y'all. Sign up for the email newsletter. We are still in a pandemic. Do you live in the United States? I do. The pandemic is fucking us up. So wear a mask. It's literally fucking us up. But wear a mask, social distance if you can, stay in the house if you can. Damn, I see y'all out at parties. Y'all having pool parties? Ridiculous. It's gonna be a long road ahead for us. So I'll see you next time. Bye.